moving again swiftly on, we now will be coming back to the topic of AI towards the end of the session when David Singh will be back, talking about how to build creativity back into your workplace, particularly as AI starts to sort of take out some of the more commodity skills and the more routine tasks in businesses. And clearly, creativity, innovation is what we're talking about here over the next 2 or 3 days. Also, creativity, innovation, clearly very, very important to building agile, adaptive businesses. But before that, though, we're going to turn to the region's sort of biggest prize, the biggest story of the last couple of years, particularly at the level of digital and financial services and ecosystem marketplaces, and the subject of Saudi Arabia. The region, the Gulf's biggest economy by far, also the biggest economy in MENA, and clearly a sort of strong strategic opportunity. So we're going to listen to a panel now looking at the opportunities in the kingdom, how to access that market. We'll then be followed by a couple of sessions looking at the role of financial services, payments, and the ongoing battle for financial inclusion as digital financial services takes hold. But for now, let's welcome Arjun Singh at AD Little for our session on Saudi Arabia. Arjun, welcome.
Thanks, mate. And I'm going to welcome Eyad Albayouk. He's the general manager with Fat6 Labs in Saudi Arabia. Eyad, first, or do you want to stand and do this?
No, let's sit down. I'm very happy to sit down. And again, thank you again for taking the time to put this together and for everything you've been doing with Fintech Tuesdays and Fintech Unplugged. So thank you.
Excellent. So we do have a small crowd. So if people want to come to the front, then it might be easier, but I'll let you be, or else we'll talk a bit louder. So it's not the first time, I guess, I've known Eyad a couple of years. And this is not the first time we're going to be sitting and talking about the kingdom and the transformation the kingdom is going through. I think the only thing we need to be cognizant is that we can't take this conversation until 2 o'clock in the morning. So we got 15 minutes. We'll keep it simple. So I think when I was just thinking about this session, I was kind of saying, right, what are the building blocks, right? I think the term was paving the road, right? And so, I guess what's going into the concrete, or what are the building blocks? And there are quite a few. So I came up with a few, and I thought we'll take a deep dive video on a few of them, right? One was around, I think, clarity of vision, which is quite clear. It was very well articulated by His Highness MBS very recently on a Fox News interview where he was very candid about what the vision is, what they're looking to achieve. There's obviously been a story of diversification. It's not a new story, but it's one which I think has accelerated, right? And then you come to what I want to call as the cultural renaissance, right? And I think we're actually experiencing it. I've been working in Saudi Arabia for the last 12 to 13 years, and I think that spread is quite palpable. Very interesting things happening in the labor markets, right? Generally in terms of the skills, I think, with the number of, women coming into the workforce, a very young demographic, so on and so forth. And if I throw a couple of last points, one is, I think, increased foreign interest, right? And that's being, I guess, that's finding its way in a number of ways. It's, on one hand, it's capital. On the other hand, it's just interesting joint venture. People are setting up production facilities, so on and so forth. And last but not least, it's sort of been, the government support, right? I tend to do a lot of work with the regulators. I think, there is actually a complete shift in the way the regulators are working. And I think the word progressive is not just a word anymore. It's actually increasingly part of the DNA. Which of these do you want to dive into?
So I think, at least from my perspective, and to be completely frank, I think a lot of the reforms that have happened over the past, whether it depends where you want to set the starting line, of course, but at least within the past 5 to 6 years, I would say, the number one KPI has been, aside, of course, from diversifying the sources of revenue away from oil and fossil fuels, but essentially it is taking care of a very big unemployment gap that was there before these reforms were in place. Historically, of course, things have been relatively centralized in terms of government employment, and that was always the status quo for decades. up until very recently. Of course, we are in a very different position today, given the population is the largest it's ever been, of course. It's arguably the youngest it may have been also in a while. And again, a new demographic requires a new job market, and that's what we're seeing. Of course, it wasn't an easy transition, I would say, but again, the latest numbers, at least as of the end of 2022, I mean, if we start off, for instance, and again, that touches on the cultural renaissance to a great degree. We started off, I would say, the decade with Saudi female unemployment at well above 30%. Today, that figure, again, it's not, we're not there yet, but it's hovering around 15%. And that is a huge reduction, within the span of less than a decade. Likewise, of course, the broader blended unemployment rate reached an all-time low of 4.8%. These numbers were unspeakable and not thought of in the past. And any fool would be remiss to think that this is driven simply by what the energy market is doing. Of course, we do have a great tailwind with what's happening with oil prices over the past 24 months or so. But again, all these are private sector jobs. They're not government-sponsored jobs, so that is definitely a step in the right direction. Of course, all the other things are complementary, and it kind of goes hand in hand. The more, let's say, business finds it easy to set up shop and operate, of course, we'll have a flow of international or foreign capital coming in. Likewise, talented people would be more likely to, of course, pack up and set up Saudi as their new home. Of course, no one would take the status quo for granted, and I don't think a lot of the policy setters are done in that sense, and I would expect more to come, hopefully, in the same right direction.
Right. So I want to probe a little bit more around, the inflow of what I call foreign businesses, foreign capital, right? How have you seen that evolve in the last sort of 5 years? And what's your sort of perspective over the next 5 years, if I may ask?
So one of the bigger mandates that really helped speed this up was digital government, which I think Saudi is quickly becoming a benchmark in that sense. Today, I mean, my wife is a foreign national, right? Onboarding her and bringing her to Saudi, her iqama was issued in less than 24 hours once we landed at a kiosk in a mall. So that makes life easier for anyone thinking about, of course, making Saudi their new home. But then again, from a purely business perspective, there has been great migration of these digital tools that we've been using at the, of course, at the Ministry of Interior level to spread and be used across business applications so that it becomes a bit easier to set up and operate. I think one of the big differentiators compared to other GCC economies is that the government so far has not adopted the let's compete on being a tax-free jurisdiction. We know we have a big size market. We know that it requires some structural changes. If you're on board with the plan, then please come over, and we'll do anything we can by way of subsidies, even government investment, just to get these things off the ground.
Okay, so I think this is a great segue for me because you used the word government, and I think regulation, right? And again, it's not a topic that can be taken lightly, especially since you are building out pretty much all facets of your economy, right? Whether it is around financial services on one hand, to tourism, to unlocking the labor markets, right, or the potential of the labor markets. I guess reorganization around how the real estate sector is developing, right? What do you, and you pick any of these regulatory bodies or hard regulations, because I think I'm putting you a very hard question. What for you has been most notable in the last, I guess, 2 to 3 years or 4 years in terms of the distinct shift? But I'm going to ask you a very hard question too. I'm sorry, I'm going to put you on the spot. What more do you think is expected and will happen in the near future?
So again, the Saudi market is quite regulated and quite organized, I must say, in multiple facets. One notable, let's say, reduction of friction that we've seen, especially, plastic slabs at the end of the day is not native to Saudi Arabia. It's a foreign investment vehicle. So we deal with the same issues as any international player trying to access the market. But just by way of a simple example, enabling entrepreneurs to come in with an entrepreneur's license that automatically waives a lot of the government fees and a lot of the, let's say, more substantial costs that they have to deal with without that framework in place, I think has been a huge success. Of course, also as a regional investor, we currently have a really large pipeline of portfolio companies that are trying to soft land into Saudi Arabia, and we're really struggling with managing 300 plus employee companies all trying to set up shop in Saudi Arabia. This is a good problem to have, but this just goes to show how attractive it is, at least from a regional perspective. Despite that tax drag, despite not using the same tools that maybe some of the other regional markets have adopted, it still is a destination for a lot of these places. Of course, I think not all government entities are created equal in that sense. Some, of course, by nature of their work and how important the regulation is in terms of consumer protectionism or protecting the financial sector and industry, of course, is paramount. Cybersecurity, stuff like that. There's no, let's say, shortcuts for these types of regulations. But again, I hope that friction is, if not eliminated, at least very reduced over the past short term, medium term, and long term.
Okay, so we're sitting here in Fintech Surge, right? We're on the summit stage, hall 7. Can I ask you a question regarding Fintech and the role it's going to play, right? So there's a number which is part of, I think, the FSDP vision, which says that we need about 525 or 550 odd fintechs by the year 230, right? I think we're sitting at about 150 to 160 currently functioning fintechs. I'm not just talking about registered entities. I'm talking about, companies which are working, hiring, delivering, creating value, solving real problems, making, Saudi Arabia more, a better country, if I may use that term, right? So just doing some back of the envelope math here, right? So we want to be 525. We've got about 7 years to go. Let's assume 100 of them will come from overseas, which I think is a fair number. 20% representation is not bad. So we need another 425, 430, which need to be local. Out of the 150, 160 today, I think about 120 are local, maybe 20 are foreign. Maybe that number is not accurate, but I'm at the ballpark. We'll obviously have some fallout. Out of that 120, some of them will not be around, right? So let's say we're down to 100. We need to generate 300 new businesses, right, in just fintech, right? And this is not just the entire sector, because there are other sectors which are much bigger. Now, 300 functioning companies across the entire life cycle of fintech requires us to be generating somewhere between 1,500 to 5,000 business ideas today, right? And you're an expert on that. I don't know, but failure rates are somewhere between 20, to 90%, depending on the subsector of fintech. How are you seeing that happen, right? So how is that road going to be paved?
So again, it is a very lofty goal, someone might say, given the status quo today and where things are. But I think one of the biggest hurdles in that perspective is that, given again the idea of and I think that's a mantra that applies within regulated industry in Saudi Arabia. It's crawl, walk, run, and not necessarily just sprint in once and break fast and move things. Because again, one of the things I think the regulators take pride in, especially from a financial perspective, is that we've been immune to a lot of the bubbles, a lot of the cycles, a lot of, let's say, the contagion that happens on the back of economic cycles. And a lot of people within these institutions believe that it's the way the regulations are structured today and the requirements that are set are what's immunizing the economy from these, let's say, catastrophes, for lack of a better word. So I don't think the regulation will be amended to reduce the requirements simply from that perspective. However, I think the bigger gap really is private sector participation in funding these ideas, right? So especially when we talk about the financial markets, especially banking institutions, we do have a sense of inertia where 9 to 10 business banks, depending on who you would consider as part of that group, have had a very comfortable position by way of operating as 1 in 10 other institutions that can do exactly what they do with a very sizable population and a very sizable economy. So I think unless these players adapt, and we've seen mixed adaptation of digitization across these 10 key banking players, but I think a lot of that will come from these businesses either spinning out divisions, restructuring, or just becoming a bit more involved in funding these ideas, because demand will always be there. And it's just a question on who gets to that demand before anyone else does. So I think that's a big component that is a hurdle, aside from, of course, whether you think the regulations are a bit too strict or a bit too soft. We do need more private sector participation in that sense. Another thing I think is, of course, we're seeing this generational transformation going from millennials to Gen Z, and you're seeing a lot more capable founders, frankly, and I'm taking on my own generation here when we talk about millennials, with the Gen Z generation that's coming into the job market. Even for us as Flat Six Labs, when we're investing, we typically don't prefer to go very young when it comes to our founders. But in Saudi, it's very difficult to say no to brilliant machine learning engineers, even if they have 6 months of actual real world experience, because they're a rare find. And of course, a lot of them get swayed by high paying jobs that attract them within that segment. From our perspective, we're trying to convince them to basically do their own thing, even if we give them a little bit of seed or pre-seed money, just to explore and see how that happens. So I think the venture capital institution, if you will, definitely has a big part to play. However, on its own, it's definitely not big or deep enough to support that transformation all at once. So I think it really comes down to private, industries' participation in funding these ideas. I think a lot of the other fundamental pillars are there. It's just matching the two together and getting things going.
Yeah, I got to thank you, but we're out of time. I see on that.